Good day, everyone. Today I'm tying a pink Hobo Spey on a shank. This is the first of series of flies I'll be tying for my trip to the Skeena River later this year for Steelhead and Salmon. I'm using a 25mm Partridge Waddington Shank. The thread to secure the tether to the shank is the Simplify Nano Silk 18-aught white. Start the thread around the halfway point and trim the tag. Secure the thread with tight wraps to the rear loop and bring it back to the start. This is to keep everything together. The hook I'm using is the Barbless OPST swing hook size 1. The tether is the Fireline 30-pound test. Take a section of the Fireline about 10 inches long and loop it through the hook. Thread the tag ends through the rear loop from underneath the shank. Measure the distance between the rear loop and the hook eye. I want enough space on the tether to change the hook. Secure the hook with tight edge-to-edge wraps along the threaded area towards the rear loop. Wrap it back to the start and whip finish to lock the thread in place. Thread both tag ends through the front loop and pull the ends through the gap firmly using pliers so it's flush with the wrap. Secure with tight wraps, keeping the tags parallel to each other towards the rear loop, and wrap it back to the start. Thread the ends through the rear loop on each side of the tether. Using pliers, grasp each strand and secure it on top of the hook. Build up the thread and trim the ends flush with the wrap. Build up the thread and whip finish. Next, I'm adding the dyed red golden pheasant crest for the tail. Measure the crest. I want the tip even with the bend of the hook. Trim the excess stem even with the end of the threaded area. Remove the excess fibers on the crest down to the stem, the same length as the threaded area, and flatten the stem. Secure on top of the threaded area and centered. Build up the thread, add thin head cement to the entire wrap. Take a piece of lead wire and secure the hook to the vise to keep it out of the way. Next, split the thread and wax both sides. Add the pink ice dub loosely. Add the dubbing twister, double over the thread twice, and spin to secure the dubbing. Brush out the dubbing to thin out the bulk around the thread. Add the hackle plier and remove the dubbing twister. Wrap the dubbing with tight edge-to-edge wraps, starting at the base of the tail going forward, pulling the fibers back with your fingers after each wrap. Wrap it to the halfway point on the threaded area. Secure by the thread, trim the excess and build up the thread and whip finish. Brush out the dubbing to free the trapped fibers. Next, prepare a dyed pink silver pheasant hackle. Fold the hackle and trim the tip the same length as the threaded area. Secure from underneath the shank, tight to the dubbing, and build up the thread. Wrap the hackle in front of the dubbing as a collar with tight edge-to-edge wraps. Secure by the stem, build up the thread whip finish, and brush out the fibers. Split the thread, wax, and add a small section of pink ice dub shimmer fringe. Trim where it's connected and spread the fibers along the thread. Thread tension is the key to this step. Add the dubbing twister, double over the thread twice, and spin to secure the fibers. Brush out the fibers thoroughly to clear the trapped fibers. Add the hackle plier and wrap the fibers as a collar in front of the hackle with edge-to-edge wraps going forward. Secure by the thread along the threaded area, whip finish, and brush out the fibers. Next, prepare 4 strands of the fine ostrich herl. Secure the herl on each side of the shank, top, bottom, left, and right. Build up the thread and whip finish. I want the tip slightly past the bend of the hook. Next, split the thread, wax both sides, and add purple ice dub loosely. Spread out the dubbing along the thread so it's even. Once again, firm thread tension is the key to this step. Add the dubbing twister, double over the thread twice, and spin to secure the dubbing. Brush out the dubbing thoroughly and attach the hackle plier. Wrap the dubbing forward with edge-to-edge wraps, pulling the fibers back with your fingers. Secure by the thread along the shank, build up the thread. Whip finish and brush out the dubbing. Split the thread, wax both sides, and add a small amount of emerald green ice dub loosely. Spread out the dubbing along the thread so it's even. Add the dubbing twister, double over the thread twice, and spin to secure the dubbing. Brush out the dubbing thoroughly and attach the hackle plier. Wrap the dubbing forward with edge-to-edge wraps, pulling the fibers back with your fingers. Secure by the thread, trim the excess. Build up the thread. Whip finish. And brush out the dubbing. Next, add the pink crinkle flash tinsel. Take a strand and fold it over the thread so it's doubled, and secure it on top of the shank tight to the dubbing. Trim the ends even with the hook point, and repeat this step on all three sides. Next, prepare the dyed yellow heron hackle. Remove the waste portion from the lower stem, trim the excess, flatten the stem, and fold the hackle. Secure the hackle by the tip tight to the dubbing from underneath the shank and trim the excess. Wrap the hackle in front of the dubbing with edge-to-edge wraps, pulling the fibers back with your fingers. Secure the hackle by the stem between the groove of the bare shank and trim the excess. Secure the thread over the wrapped hackle stem and build up the thread into a taper. Prepare a large dyed pink guinea fowl hackle. Flatten the stem and fold the hackle. Secure from underneath the shank. Trim the excess flush with the wrap and build up the thread. Wrap the hackle with edge-to-edge wraps, pulling the fibers back with your fingers. Secure the hackle by the stem from underneath the shank between the groove. Trim the excess and brush out the hackle. Next, prepare 4 strands of dyed pink peacock herl tips. Secure the single strands in front of the collar the same way as the tinsel on each side, and have the links the same or slightly longer than the tinsel. Next, prepare 2 jungle cock feathers. Place both feathers together so the tips are even. Measure the feathers. I want the ends even with the tips of the dyed pink guinea fowl. Remove the waste fibers from the stem at that point. Flatten the stem and secure from underneath along each side, left and right. Fold the stems back to reinforce the feathers. Secure. Trim the excess and build up the thread. Prepare a small section of the dyed pink fin raccoon fur. Trim the hide and comb out the short underfur. Leave a few strands of the long guard hairs with the fur. Secure the fur on top of the shank with a soft loop and a cinch wrap to keep it in place. Next, prepare the dyed blue grizzly hackle tips. Match the feathers so the tips are even and measure. I want the tips even with the hook point. Remove the waste portion from the stems on both feathers and flatten the stems. Secure the hackle tips one at a time on each side of the wing by the stem and whip finish. Trim the excess stem and the fur flush with the wraps on a taper. Build up the thread on a taper. Add the red thread, secure it with the white thread. Build up the thread, whip finish, and trim the white thread. Wrap the red thread over the white head, build up the thread into a taper, whip finish, and trim. Add thin head cement to penetrate the wrap and let it dry. Once completely dry, add the 5-minute epoxy evenly around the head. Here's the complete fly. I left a small space behind the eye in case I need to use a riffle hitch. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and hit the like button to see more.